The rancher found an Apache woman in his bed, and his life changed forever. Thomas had always lived a life of routine. His ranch sat far from the nearest town, a wide stretch of land surrounded by rocky hills and open plains. The early mornings were cold, and the wind often carried dust and the scent of dry grass. He had learned long ago to rely only on himself. His wife had passed years ago, leaving him alone with the ranch, the cattle, and the endless horizon. Life was hard, but Thomas liked it that way. He felt a quiet pride in his solitude. One morning, the winter sun barely peeking over the horizon, Thomas awoke to a strange sound. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling the wooden shutters of his cabin. But the sound continued, a soft shuffle that didn't belong to the wind. He opened his eyes, rubbed them, and looked around. The room was quiet. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers in the hearth. And then he saw her. Lying across his bed, curled under a thin blanket, was a woman. She was small, her dark hair tangled and her face pale. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, quick breaths. Thomas froze. His first thought was that someone had broken into his home. Fear raced through him, but so did a strange sense of caution. He didn't want to scare her. Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice low and careful. The woman stirred, opening her eyes. They were wide, dark, and full of a mix of fear and exhaustion. She didn't answer. Instead, she shook slightly, hugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Thomas noticed bruises on her arms, dirt on her clothes, and the way she trembled as if every sound frightened her. He quickly assessed the situation. She was not a threat. She was tired, hungry, and scared, and somehow she had ended up in his bed. He had no idea how or why, but instinct told him she needed help. Thomas was not a man given to emotion, but he felt a spark of something unfamiliar: concern, empathy, maybe even responsibility. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice calm, "let's get you some food. You must be starving." The woman looked at him but didn't speak. She seemed unsure, hesitant, as if she had learned long ago not to trust strangers. Thomas moved carefully, getting up and starting a small fire in the hearth. He fetched a pot of water and some dried meat from a cupboard. As he prepared breakfast, he spoke softly. "It's all right. You're safe here. I won't hurt you." Slowly, almost reluctantly, she sat up. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. Thomas handed her some food. She took it with shaking hands and ate quietly, her eyes flicking around the room as though watching for danger. As she ate, Thomas studied her. There was something familiar about her features: strong cheekbones, dark eyes, and a grace in the way she moved, even in exhaustion. It struck him that she might be Apache. He had heard stories from travelers and neighboring ranchers, though he had never met anyone from the tribe. Her eyes held intelligence and courage, even now, hidden behind fear. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked carefully. She shook her head, but he noticed the subtle wince as she moved. There were cuts on her arms, old and new, and a bruise forming on her cheek. He fetched a clean cloth, some water, and carefully cleaned the wounds. She flinched but didn't pull away. It was the first sign of trust he had seen from her. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. "No one will bother you. You're safe with me." She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But she only nodded slightly, barely perceptible. Thomas understood. She was not ready to trust words. Trust would take time. The hours passed slowly. Thomas worked around the ranch, feeding the horses and checking the fences, but he kept glancing toward the cabin. The woman remained inside, wrapped in the blanket, resting. Occasionally she peeked out the window, watching the plains, the cattle, the distant hills. Thomas wondered what thoughts ran through her mind. Where had she come from? Why was she here? And most importantly, what had happened to her? By the afternoon, the sun had climbed higher, and Thomas decided to give her a bath. She stiffened at the suggestion, clearly frightened, but he spoke gently, explaining that he would help her clean and make her comfortable. Slowly, carefully, she allowed him to help her. The water was warm, and the simple act of washing away dirt and grime seemed to ease her tension slightly. As she sat wrapped in a clean blanket, Thomas prepared a place for her to rest properly. He found an extra bedroll and blankets, laying them out on the floor near the fire. She hesitated but eventually moved to the new spot, curling up as she had before. Thomas watched her for a moment, feeling an odd sense of responsibility. This stranger had come into his life in a way that defied explanation. He didn't know why, but he knew that something had shifted in him the moment he saw her. Evening came, and the wind howled outside. Thomas cooked a simple meal of beans and bread and placed it near her. She ate slowly, still wary but no longer trembling as much. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of coyotes. Thomas tried to imagine what it must have been like for her, how far she had come, what dangers she had faced. The thought made his chest tighten. He had faced hard winters and storms, but nothing compared to what she must have endured. Night fell, and Thomas prepared to sleep in his own bed. He paused, looking at her. She was curled under the blankets, finally showing a hint of calm. He realized that he could not leave her alone in the cold and dark of the cabin. Something in him compelled him to stay. He decided to rest on a nearby chair, keeping the fire alive and a watchful eye over her. As he drifted off, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. A stranger had entered his life in the most unexpected way, and though he didn't understand why, he felt a connection forming. There was mystery in her silence, strength in her fragility, and a spark of humanity that he had not encountered in a long time. The night passed quietly. The woman slept more soundly, and Thomas found himself watching over her like a guardian. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that his life had changed. Something had shifted in the quiet of the cabin, in the lonely expanse of his ranch. A new chapter had begun, one that neither of them could yet understand. By morning, Thomas was certain of one thing: he could not turn her away. He did not know how she had come to his bed, nor did he know what dangers might follow her, but he knew that she needed him, and he needed her in ways he could not yet explain. The day had started like any other, cold and quiet on the ranch, but now it held the weight of promise, mystery, and the beginning of an extraordinary story. And so, with the first light of dawn painting the plains in soft gold, Thomas resolved to protect her, to help her heal, and to discover the story that had brought this Apache woman into his life and into his heart. Days passed slowly on the ranch, each one bringing small changes that Thomas could hardly believe. The Apache woman remained quiet, often sitting by the fire or peering out of the window, her eyes following the movements of the cattle across the plains. She had not yet spoken a single full sentence, but Thomas understood enough from her gestures, expressions, and the occasional broken word to know that she had suffered greatly before arriving at his cabin. He decided to give her a name for ease of reference. He chose Yana, which in the Apache language meant eternal blossom. It seemed fitting, for though she appeared fragile, there was a quiet strength about her, something resilient that refused to break despite the hardships she had endured. Thomas knew that trust could not be forced. He tried to make the cabin comfortable, arranging extra blankets, preparing warm meals, and keeping the hearth fire always alive. Sometimes he would talk to her as he worked, softly, without expecting a response. He told her about his days, the cattle, the harsh winters, and the vast plains that stretched beyond the horizon. At first, Ayana only listened, her dark eyes following his every movement. Occasionally she would shake her head, smile faintly, or point toward an object to indicate understanding. It was slow, but Thomas recognized these as signs of trust beginning to grow. He had learned long ago that patience was the key to survival on the frontier, and now he applied the same patience to building a bond with her. One afternoon, Thomas noticed that Ayana had begun examining the tools in the cabin. She touched them carefully as if unsure whether they would harm her. He watched her with curiosity. It struck him how observant she was, how she noticed the smallest details in her surroundings. "Would you like to help me feed the cattle?" he asked gently. Yana looked at him, her eyes wide with hesitation. She had never spoken, but now she seemed to weigh his words carefully. Slowly, she nodded, and Thomas smiled. The journey to the barn was quiet, filled with the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots. The cattle watched them curiously as they approached. Thomas demonstrated how to scatter the feed, how to check for injured animals, and how to handle the tools safely. Yana followed his movements with careful attention, mimicking his actions. Though her hands trembled slightly, she performed the tasks well, showing that she had an inner strength and intelligence that Thomas admired. During their work, Thomas tried to speak with her again. "Where are you from?" he asked softly. Yana hesitated. Her lips moved, forming words he could not understand, then she shook her head. It was clear she was not yet ready to share her story in full. Thomas did not push. He knew that her silence was not a refusal, it was a shield, a way to protect herself until she felt safe. Over the next few days, Thomas noticed small changes. Yana began to eat more, move more confidently, and even laugh quietly when something amused her. One evening, as he taught her how to mend a fence, she handed him a small bundle of herbs she had picked. They smelled earthy and fresh. She gestured to him to smell them, then nodded toward the animals. Thomas realized that she was showing him a traditional way to calm the cattle or protect them from illness. "This is useful," he said, smiling. "Thank you." Yana only nodded, her face calm and serious. Yet Thomas could see a hint of pride in her eyes. She was sharing a piece of her world, her knowledge, with him. And in doing so, she was slowly letting him into hers. Life on the ranch became a quiet rhythm. Mornings were spent with chores and tending the animals, afternoons teaching each other small skills, and evenings near the fire, where they would sit in a companionable silence. Thomas began to notice that her presence, once strange and unsettling, had become a comfort. He no longer feared the unknown. Instead, he felt a growing sense of purpose in caring for her. One cold evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned soft shades of pink and orange, Thomas sat near the fire, warming his hands. Yana approached with a small clay pot, gesturing for him to drink. The liquid inside smelled unfamiliar, earthy, and strong. Thomas took it, sipping carefully. The taste was bitter at first, but it warmed him immediately. He realized that she had prepared it using herbs she knew would strengthen him against the winter chill. "You made this?" he asked, genuinely impressed. Yana nodded, a faint smile appearing on her face. For the first time, Thomas felt that she trusted him enough to share a part of herself without fear. However, not everything was peaceful. The town was not far, and soon enough, rumors began to reach the ranch. Travelers spoke of a stranger in Thomas's cabin, a woman no one in the town knew. Some called her a thief, others a runaway. A few warned Thomas that harboring her could bring trouble. Thomas felt a surge of anger. He knew the woman before him was no danger. She was injured, scared, and in need of help. And yet the world outside was quick to judge, slow to understand. That evening he spoke to Ayana quietly. "People might not understand you," he said, "but I do, and I will protect you." She looked at him then, her eyes dark and deep, as if she were trying to read his heart. She did not speak, but Thomas felt her trust deepen in that moment. It was as if she understood that he would not abandon her, no matter what others said. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to learn more about her past, not through words but through small stories and actions. He noticed scars on her arms and legs, each one telling a tale of struggle. He saw the careful way she moved, avoiding danger even in small tasks. One day, he found a small bundle of worn clothing she had kept hidden, a clue to the journey she had endured to reach his ranch. Though she did not explain, Thomas could imagine the hardships she had faced: long walks through harsh terrain, hunger, fear, and the constant threat of violence. Thomas realized that helping her was no longer just an act of kindness. It had become a responsibility, a bond. He began to imagine what her life had been like before she came to him, and he felt a deep respect for her courage. Despite everything she had suffered, she had survived. And now she had arrived at his doorstep, bringing with her a presence that would change his life forever. He started to teach her more about ranch life, how to handle horses, mend fences, and cook over the fire. Each day, Ayana's confidence grew. She began to speak a few words, first simple ones, then short sentences. She learned to ask for what she needed, and Thomas learned to listen carefully. Their communication, once limited to gestures and expressions, blossomed into a quiet understanding, a connection that went beyond words. One chilly morning, Thomas found her outside, watching the sunrise over the hills. She looked serene, almost at peace. He joined her silently, standing a few steps away. For a moment, they simply watched the sky together, feeling the cold wind on their faces. Thomas realized that she had begun to trust him completely. The woman who had arrived in his bed, scared and trembling, was now slowly opening her heart. And Thomas, who had lived so long in solitude, began to feel something unfamiliar. He felt hope. He felt companionship. He felt the stirrings of care that went beyond simple responsibility. Ayana had become not just a guest or a stranger, but a part of his life, a presence that made the ranch feel alive in a way it never had before. As part 2 of their story closed, the bond between Thomas and Ayana had begun to take shape. Trust was growing, understanding was forming, and a quiet companionship was blossoming. They had yet to speak the words that would change everything, but the foundation was being laid. The woman who had once been a frightened stranger was slowly becoming someone he could rely on, and someone who would rely on him in return. Their days continued in this quiet rhythm, each one bringing new lessons, small victories, and a growing awareness that life could be richer, deeper, and more meaningful when shared. Thomas knew that challenges would come, that the outside world might never fully understand Ayana, and that danger could lurk just beyond the hills. But for now, in the simple acts of kindness, teaching, and quiet observation, they had found something precious: trust, connection, and the first fragile hints of hope. And in that fragile hope, Thomas felt his heart begin to change, slowly but surely, knowing that his life and hers would never be the same again. As the weeks turned into months, the rhythm of life on Thomas's ranch became a quiet comfort for both him and Ayana. The one stranger in his cabin now moved with confidence, her steps sure and deliberate. She had begun to speak more, though still softly, choosing her words carefully. Thomas listened patiently, learning not only her words but the stories behind them, pieces of her past, fragments of her life before the journey that had brought her to his door. Thomas had always known how to survive in the harsh lands of the Southwest, but he realized there were lessons he could learn from Ayana as well. She had a connection to the land that was different from his own. While he saw it as property to manage and protect, she saw it as a living, breathing presence. She would point out herbs and plants, explain their uses, and even show him how to find water in places that seemed barren. Her knowledge of the natural world amazed him, and he began to feel that he had underestimated the wisdom that came from a life lived close to nature. One morning, after a heavy frost had coated the plains in a sparkling layer of ice, Thomas found Ayana sitting outside the cabin, her eyes scanning the distant hills. He approached quietly, careful not to disturb her thoughts. She smiled faintly when she saw him and gestured for him to sit beside her. "I teach," she said, pointing to the ground where she had arranged small piles of herbs and roots. She spoke slowly, trying to find the right words in English. Thomas nodded, encouraging her to continue. "These medicine," she explained, pointing to a bundle of dried plants. "Help sick, help animals, help people." Thomas studied the herbs with interest. "You've learned all this from your people?" he asked. Ayana nodded. Yes. My family teach me. She paused, her gaze distant. Bad people take family, run. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. Though he had suspected she had suffered, hearing it in her own words made it real. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I can't imagine what you went through, but you're safe now. You don't have to be afraid here. Yana looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Slowly, she reached out and touched his hand, a small gesture of trust. Thomas felt a warmth spread through him, stronger than anything he had felt in years. This silent moment spoke more than words ever could. From that day on, their connection deepened. Thomas taught her how to care for the horses, mend fences, and manage the cattle, while Yana taught him the subtle ways of the land, the hidden properties of plants, and the wisdom of patience. She had a gentle way of moving, a rhythm that seemed to mirror the land itself. Thomas found that he began to notice things he had never seen before, the way the wind whispered through the grass, the patterns of birds in flight, the subtle signs of an approaching storm. Evenings were the most precious time. After the work was done, they would sit by the fire in the cabin, sharing stories. Yana would speak of her village, the people she had lost, the traditions she had grown up with. Thomas would tell her about his life on the ranch, the winters he had endured, and the loneliness he had felt after losing his wife. These stories, once painful, became threads weaving them together. Each tale, each shared memory, built a bridge of understanding between them. One night, as a cold wind rattled the shutters, Thomas noticed Ayanna drawing in the dirt with a stick. Curious, he knelt beside her. She pointed to the lines, showing him shapes of animals, patterns of the stars, and symbols he could barely recognize. This stars, she said, pointing upward through the window, guide people, guide home. Thomas looked at the sky, the vast expanse filled with countless stars. He realized she was teaching him something profound. Life on the ranch had been measured by work and survival, but she saw it differently. Every star, every plant, every sound of the land had meaning, a purpose, a story. He felt humbled by her wisdom. Their bond was not without challenges. Communication remained difficult, and sometimes misunderstandings arose. Yet, Thomas learned to read her expressions, her gestures, and her silence. He discovered that trust was not just in words but in actions, in consistency, in care. Yana, too, began to trust him more, allowing herself to speak freely, laugh, and even express concern for him. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the edge of the ranch, a sudden storm approached. Dark clouds rolled in and the wind picked up, carrying sharp rain and dust. Thomas moved quickly to secure the animals, but Ayanna, already familiar with sudden changes in weather, guided him to check weaker fences first. Together they worked efficiently, her knowledge complementing his experience. By the time the storm hit fully, the cattle were safe, the fences secured, and both of them drenched but unharmed. Afterward, they returned to the cabin, exhausted but grateful. Yana dried her hands over the fire, her face bright with a small smile. Thomas looked at her and realized that he had begun to feel something he had thought impossible, a deep admiration and care that went beyond friendship. She had become not just a helper, not just a companion, but someone who touched his heart in ways he had not expected. Over time, the townspeople began to notice changes too. Some still whispered about the woman on Thomas's ranch, but others saw how capable and gentle she was. Slowly, respect began to replace suspicion, though Thomas knew that full acceptance would take time. He didn't mind. What mattered most was the bond he shared with Ayanna, the trust and understanding that had grown in the quiet moments of work, learning, and care. One evening, as the sun set and painted the plains in shades of gold and pink, Thomas and Ayanna sat outside the cabin, sharing a simple meal of bread and stew. She laughed softly at something he said, the sound like music to his ears. It was a small sound, but it carried with it the weight of their growing connection. He realized that he looked forward to these moments more than anything else. "You happy?" Jana asked quietly, her English still broken but understandable. Thomas smiled. "Yes," he said. "I'm happy. You help me see things differently. Life better." She nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried an honesty that words often failed to capture. They were learning from each other, teaching each other patience, respect, and the value of trust. As the nights grew colder, Thomas began to think of ways to make the cabin warmer, more comfortable for Iana. He built extra shelves, added more blankets, and even constructed a small hearth area where she could sit and cook safely. She, in turn, taught him to prepare herbal teas that warmed the body and calmed the mind. Every day they learned more about each other's worlds, blending their knowledge and experiences into a shared life. One night, after a long day of work, Thomas found Ayana sitting quietly by the fire, staring into the flames. He joined her silently, feeling the calm that came with shared understanding. She handed him a small piece of cloth, embroidered with simple patterns. "For memory," she said softly. Thomas took it, touched the embroidery, and felt a deep appreciation. It was a gift, a symbol of trust and a connection between their lives. He realized then that this woman who had arrived at his doorstep as a stranger had become something more. A partner, a teacher, and slowly, someone who was opening his heart again. As part 3 drew to a close, the quiet bond between Thomas and Ayana had grown into something powerful. It was not yet love in words, but it was love in action, in care, in understanding, and in the shared moments that made each day meaningful. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home filled with life, learning, and connection. Thomas knew that challenges would continue to arise, and that the outside world might never fully understand Ayana. Yet in these months of shared labor, laughter, and quiet conversation, he had discovered a truth he could not ignore. Life was richer, fuller, and more beautiful when shared with someone who trusted you, who taught you, and who walked beside you through hardship and calm alike. And as the stars emerged in the clear night sky, Thomas realized that this journey of understanding and trust was only the beginning. Their lives were intertwined now, bound by respect, shared experiences, and the quiet but growing promise of something extraordinary. Months had passed since Ayana first appeared in Thomas's cabin, and the quiet rhythm of ranch life had become a shared life. They had grown closer, not just in daily routines but in understanding and care for one another. Thomas had learned to read Ayana's expressions, gestures, and small actions. He noticed how she smiled when she was proud of something she had accomplished, how she laughed softly at small jokes, and how her eyes softened when she looked at him. Ayana, too, had begun to open her heart. She spoke more freely now, sharing stories from her childhood in the Apache village, the festivals, the songs, and the lessons she had learned from her family. Some stories were joyful, others sorrowful, and Thomas listened with patience and respect. He began to feel that he was not only protecting her but also learning from her in ways he had never imagined. One morning, Thomas found Ayana near the river that ran through his property. She was kneeling on the bank, collecting herbs and examining plants. The sun reflected off the water, casting a golden light on her face. Thomas approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "You've been out here long," he said gently. Ayana looked up, a small smile on her lips. "I help learn river," she replied, her English still broken but understandable. "Water life, keep safe." Thomas watched her work and realized how much she had adapted to life on the ranch. She had grown stronger, more confident, and yet there was still a softness about her, a quiet grace that he admired deeply. He offered to help her, and together they worked to gather herbs and clean the area. Their movements became synchronized, each learning from the other, sharing knowledge, and enjoying the simple pleasure of cooperation. As the days went on, Thomas noticed that his feelings for Ayana were changing. He no longer saw her merely as a stranger in need of protection. She had become someone he cared for deeply. He admired her courage, her intelligence, and the way she saw the world. Yet he was cautious. He did not want to rush, to frighten her, or to let his feelings interfere with the trust they had built. Their bond was tested one afternoon when a group of townspeople arrived at the ranch unexpectedly. They had heard rumors of the Apache woman living there and were curious, suspicious, and in some cases judgmental. Thomas met them at the edge of the property, standing firmly by Ayana's side. "This is my home," he said firmly. "She is safe here. You will not threaten her." The townspeople muttered among themselves, some angry, some hesitant. Ayana stayed behind Thomas, watching the scene silently. She did not speak, but Thomas felt her trust in him strengthen in that moment. She knew he would not abandon her, even when others questioned her presence. After the townspeople left, Thomas and Ayana returned to the cabin. She seemed quiet, her face thoughtful. Thomas offered her tea, and they sat by the fire in silence for a while. Then she spoke softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you, you protect me," she said. Thomas smiled, touched by her words. "Always," he replied. "You are important to me." The simplicity of the statement carried weight, and Ayana's eyes softened. She nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind his words. Their connection had deepened, moving beyond trust into something more profound, a bond built on mutual respect, care, and the beginnings of love. As winter approached, the ranch faced its usual challenges. Cold winds swept across the plains, and the days grew shorter. Thomas and Ayana worked side by side to prepare the animals for the harsh months ahead. She learned quickly, mastering tasks that had once seemed difficult. Thomas admired her determination and patience. She, in turn, learned from him, gaining confidence in her ability to survive and thrive in this new environment. One evening, as snow began to fall lightly, Thomas found Ayana sitting near the fire, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He joined her, offering her a cup of warm tea. She accepted it with a small smile, and for a while they simply sat together, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "You happy?" Ayana asked, her eyes meeting his. Thomas nodded. "Yes, I happy. You here. Life better." Ayana's smile grew, and she reached out to touch his hand gently. The simple gesture spoke volumes. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of their feelings, a quiet confirmation that their bond had grown into something deeper than friendship. Despite the growing closeness, Thomas knew that the world outside the ranch was not always kind. He worried about the judgment and prejudice that Ayana might face if people truly knew her story. But he also knew that he would not let her face it alone. He had come to care for her deeply, and he would protect her at all costs. Their evenings became a time for sharing and learning. Thomas taught Ayana to read simple maps and keep records of the cattle and crops. She taught him the significance of certain plants, the meaning of symbols, and the stories of her people. Through these lessons, they learned to understand each other more fully, bridging the gap between their worlds. One night, as a full moon rose over the plains, Thomas found Ayana looking out the window at the silver light reflecting off the snow. He joined her quietly, feeling a sense of peace in the shared silence. "You, moon," she said softly, pointing. "Guide people." Thomas followed her gaze, watching the light stretch across the plains. He realized that she was teaching him to see the world differently, to appreciate the beauty and guidance that nature provided. He felt a deep respect for her wisdom, for the way she viewed life with care and reverence. The bond between them continued to grow stronger. They laughed together, shared meals, worked side by side, and comforted each other in moments of fear or uncertainty. Thomas found that he looked forward to each day, not just for the work or the routine, but for the time spent with Ayana. She had brought life, warmth, and meaning back into his world. Yet, challenges remained. The townspeople's suspicion lingered, and Thomas knew that acceptance would take time. But he also knew that the connection he shared with Ayana was more important than the opinions of others. Their trust, care, and growing love formed a bond that could not be easily broken. One snowy afternoon, Thomas and Ayana worked together to repair a section of the fence damaged by winter storms. As they labored, Thomas realized how natural it felt to have her by his side, to share the work, and to exchange quiet words of encouragement. He began to understand that their partnership was more than practical. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply human. As the day ended and they returned to the cabin, Thomas felt a sense of contentment he had not known in years. The warmth of the fire, the presence of Ayana, and the knowledge that they could face challenges together created a feeling of security and happiness. He realized that his life had been changed not just by her presence, but by the way she had taught him to see the world differently, to value trust, care, and love. That night, as they sat together, Thomas spoke softly. "Ayana, you special. I care for you." Ayana's eyes met his, wide and shining. She reached out and placed her hand on his, a simple yet profound gesture of connection. Words were not necessary. They understood each other through actions, trust, and shared experience. Their bond had grown into something extraordinary, something neither had anticipated but both cherished deeply. And so, as part 4 came to a close, Thomas and Ayana faced the future together, their lives intertwined by trust, shared labor, and a growing love that defied the hardships and suspicions of the world outside the ranch. They had learned to care for each other, to protect each other, and to find joy and meaning in the simplest moments of life. The ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, had become a home filled with warmth, understanding, and the quiet promise of love. Thomas knew that challenges would continue to come, but he also knew that with Ayana by his side, they could face anything. Their lives were forever changed, and together, they were beginning a story that neither had expected, but both would treasure for the rest of their days. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and the ranch began to bloom once more. The snow melted, revealing green grass, wildflowers, and fresh shoots that promised a season of growth. For Thomas and Ayana, life had settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm. They worked side by side, sharing the responsibilities of the ranch and the quiet joys of daily life. Thomas had come to understand the depth of his feelings for Ayana. She was no longer just a companion or a guest. She had become a part of his life in ways he had never imagined possible. Her laughter filled the cabin with warmth, her knowledge enriched his work, and her presence gave his days purpose. Likewise, Ayana had grown to trust Thomas completely. She had learned to rely on him not only for protection but for companionship, guidance, and friendship that had blossomed into love. One morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Thomas found Ayana tending to the flowers near the cabin. She moved gracefully, carefully watering each plant, humming softly to herself. He watched her for a moment, noticing how natural and serene she seemed. It struck him how far she had come, from the frightened woman he had first found in his bed to the confident, gentle, and wise person she had become. "You beautiful day," she said softly, gesturing to the sky. "Sun warm, life good," Thomas smiled. "Yes, life good. Because you here." His words were simple, but their meaning was deep and clear. Ayana paused, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She smiled faintly, placing her hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings they both carried but rarely spoke aloud. Spring brought new challenges to the ranch. The weather could be unpredictable, and there were always repairs, livestock to tend, and work to be done. But Thomas and Ayana faced these challenges together. They had learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, and their teamwork became seamless. Where Thomas had experience and practical knowledge, Ayana brought intuition, observation, and the quiet wisdom of her people. One day, while checking the far pasture, they noticed a calf trapped in a small ravine. Thomas moved quickly to rescue it, but Ayanna guided him, pointing to safer footholds and suggesting ways to secure the animal without harm. Together, they managed to free the calf, both laughing with relief and triumph. These small moments of shared effort strengthened their bond, reminding them that they were stronger together than apart. Evenings became times of reflection and closeness. They would sit by the fire in the cabin, sharing meals and stories, speaking of dreams, hopes, and the life they wished to build together. Ayanna told Thomas more about her village, the songs, and the ceremonies, and he listened with fascination, learning to appreciate the beauty of her culture. In turn, he shared his own memories of the land, the ranch, and the family he had lost. Through these exchanges, they built a bridge between two worlds, one that blended understanding, respect, and love. As spring matured, the townspeople began to see Ayanna not as a stranger or a threat, but as part of the life of the ranch. Some came to seek her advice on herbs, others marveled at her knowledge of the land, and gradually she gained respect and admiration. Thomas felt proud, not only of Ayanna, but of the life they were creating together. It was a life built on patience, understanding, and trust, and it was theirs alone. One evening, under a sky painted with the colors of sunset, Thomas and Ayanna sat outside, sharing a simple meal. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh grass. Thomas reached out, gently taking Ayanna's hand in his. "You mean everything," he said softly, his words deliberate and sincere. "Life better with you." Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes shining. She nodded, her hand squeezing his gently. "I trust you." "Always," she whispered. For a long moment they sat in silence, holding hands, letting the words and the quiet of the evening convey the depth of their feelings. In that moment there was no fear, no uncertainty, only the knowledge that they belonged together, that they had found in each other something rare and precious. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Ayanna continued to grow closer. Their bond deepened into love, expressed in small gestures, shared laughter, and quiet moments of care. Thomas taught her to ride horses across the plains, and she guided him to places where the land was richest, showing him secret springs and hidden patches of herbs. Each day was a lesson, a joy, and a reinforcement of their connection. As the season progressed, Thomas made a decision. He could no longer ignore the feelings that had grown in his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with deep oranges and purples, he spoke to Ayanna. "Ayanna, I love you," he said simply. Her eyes widened for a moment, and then a soft smile spread across her face. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It was a moment of honesty, of truth, and of deep connection. They embraced quietly, knowing that their lives had changed forever. With love came new responsibilities and challenges. Thomas knew that life on the ranch would always be difficult, and he wanted to ensure that Ayanna felt safe, respected, and valued. He also understood that the outside world could be harsh, but together they could face whatever came their way. They had built a foundation of trust and understanding that was stronger than prejudice or fear. In the weeks that followed, they began to plan for the future. They repaired the ranch, expanded the garden, and nurtured the land with care. Thomas taught Ayanna to manage more of the ranch independently, and she shared her knowledge of plants, animals, and survival skills. Together, they created a life of balance, work and rest, learning and teaching, love and companionship. Their love was not just for each other, but for the life they had built together. Each sunrise, each gentle breeze, each shared meal became a celebration of their bond. Ayanna brought light and warmth to Thomas's life, and he in turn gave her security, care, and the knowledge that she belonged. One day, as they walked together across the plains, Thomas turned to Ayanna. "We life together?" he asked, a hint of hope and uncertainty in his voice. Ayanna smiled, her eyes bright. "Yes, together. Always," she replied. It was a promise, a vow unspoken in ceremony but understood in every action and glance. They had faced fear, prejudice, and uncertainty, yet they had found each other. Their lives were no longer separate, they were intertwined, bound by love, trust, and shared experience. As the seasons changed, their bond continued to grow. They celebrated small joys. The first calf of spring, a successful harvest, the return of birds to the ranch. They supported each other through hardships, harsh storms, long nights, and the occasional challenge from the outside world. Each trial strengthened their connection, proving that their love was resilient and enduring. Years passed, and the ranch flourished. Thomas and Ayanna had become a part of the land, just as the land had become a part of them. Their story spread quietly through the nearby town, not as gossip but as a tale of respect, love, and partnership. People came to admire Ayanna's knowledge, Thomas's fairness, and the way they had built a life together. They were no longer just a rancher and a stranger. They were a family, a symbol of trust and courage. One quiet evening, as the sun set over the plains, Thomas and Ayanna sat together outside the cabin, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. Their hands were intertwined, their hearts connected in ways words could not express. Thomas looked at Ayanna, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "You changed my life," he said softly. Ayanna smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "And you changed mine," she replied. In that moment they understood the truth of their journey. A chance encounter, a woman lost, frightened, and alone had brought them together. They had faced challenges, learned from each other, and built a life of love, trust, and respect. Their hearts were bound not by circumstance alone, but by choice, care, and the quiet courage of opening themselves to each other. As night fell, they sat by the fire, listening to the wind rustle through the plains, feeling the warmth of the hearth and the unspoken promise of their shared future. The ranch, once a place of solitude and labor, had become a home filled with life, laughter, and love. Thomas and Ayanna had discovered that true happiness comes not from wealth, comfort, or ease, but from connection, trust, and the courage to care for another heart as deeply as one's own. And so, their lives continued, forever changed by a single moment of chance, a moment that had brought an Apache woman into a rancher's life, transforming both of them in ways they could never have imagined. Together they faced the world, hand in hand, hearts intertwined, and a future bright with promise, love, and the quiet joy of shared life. The story of Thomas and Ayanna became more than just a tale of survival. It became a story of trust, respect, courage, and the enduring power of love. A love that began with a stranger in a bed, but grew into a lifetime of companionship, understanding, and a bond that neither time nor hardship could break.